Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. I've just read The Old Curiosity Shop, and it was not what I was expecting. As I turned the pages, the author seemed to appear in a puff of smoke and with a sweeping theatrical gesture hurl all my preconceptions out of the window. I don't know why I'm surprised. These episodes really should have taught me to realise by now the genius that I'm dealing with, and yet somehow I still manage to underestimate him. The Old Curiosity Shop is an enchanting read that stays with you long after you've put it down again. It starts with the narrator out walking late at night, who comes across a young girl wandering the street, lost and alone. He takes her by the hand to help her home, but in that moment he observes something strange about the girl. It's as if she is leading and taking care of him, rather than he protecting her. The girl is, of course, little Nell, and this first encounter sets the pattern of her story to follow. Here to talk to us about the novel is the brilliant Dr. Claire Wood, who is a lecturer in Victorian literature at the University of Leicester and a former research associate at the University of York. Claire's writing on Dickens includes Dickens and the Business of Death, published by Cambridge University Press. Claire is also a founder of the Dickens Code, which seeks to crack the mysteries of Dickens's unique form of shorthand, a project that has just been nominated for a Times Education Award. Also joining us to read extracts from the Old Curiosity Shop is one of my best friends of the last 27 years. You don't mind me being sentimental, do you? I mean, this is a Dickens podcast. I'm talking about the brilliant actor Gunnar Cawthry. I hope you enjoy the episode. Claire, hello, welcome.
Hi, Dominic. It is such a pleasure to be here.
I'm so thrilled to have you here because actually of all the guests, you have been the hardest to book. It's partly my fault as well, but so many things happened, including, I think, appendicitis, COVID,
Yes.
travel to America. I mean, quite a lot came in.
Well, let's hope that this will be worth the wait then, Dominic.
Oh, no, it definitely will. I'm very grateful to you straight away because when I first wrote to you, I hadn't quite fixed on what we would talk about. And you mentioned the Old Curiosity Shop. And to put it completely bluntly out there, it wasn't top of my list of Dickens books to read. I hadn't read it. And I think in some ways Oscar Wilde has slightly spoilt it for me and given me a slightly false impression of what it's like to actually read. So, but I want you to know that I absolutely love it. I think it's some of the funniest passages in there, as well as some of the most touching. So yeah. What attracted you to it initially?
Yeah, wow, such a good question. And I should say in starting, well, thank goodness you've become a fan in the process. You've not let Wilde put you off completely, because I think for so many people that is the starting point with this novel. And certainly if you go back a decade or maybe two, it was a way to show your critical chops, to show that you were serious about literature by dissing the Old Curiosity Shop, by saying, oh, you know, that novel by Dickens, it's absurd, it's sentimental, it's maudlin, you know, what a piece of rubbish. But I think when you actually sit down and read it, when you give it that space, when you give it the benefit of the doubt, I think it's a hugely rich novel. And I came to this one relatively late. I was studying for my MA at the time and catching up on all of those Dickenses that I'd never read because the dissertation was on Dickens and death and commodification. And so this one actually was dead in my wheelhouse. And I remember sitting down to read it with very few expectations in terms of the content. I knew its reputation for being sort of morbid, but I didn't know so much what the novel would be. And actually finding myself hooked right from the start, when this odd old character, Master Humphrey, draws us into the London streets at night and this apparently chance meeting with a young girl. And with every page, I just got deeper and deeper into this story, which takes so many weird and often wonderful turns. It is very different from the late Dickens that I was familiar with when I came to this, that densely, carefully plotted, well-developed, balanced kind of narrative. I know you were talking about Bleak House recently, and this is a completely different sort of thing. But at the same time, I think it's a beautiful thing in its weirdness and inconsistency. I remember too a social version of live tweeting. I was reading this before we had Twitter, and my flatmates would say, well, what's happening in this novel now? And I'd say, well, you're never going to believe it. A bunch of dancing dogs have just turned up, and they're all wearing tiny jackets and like cranking a barrel organ. And they'd say again, well, what's happened now? And I said, well, you won't believe the heroine's being tormented by this sort of evil dwarf figure and pursued across England. And do you know, with every development, telling it secondhand made it seem more and more bizarre. But when you're actually within that narrative, when you're immersed within it, it makes a beautiful kind of sense, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not a term that existed in the 19th century, but magical realism. I mean, I think it has a lot of Angela Carter sort of feel to it, possibly from my reading, because I went to it knowing nothing about it apart from the fact that I was meant to find Nell's death funny. And that was it. That's all I had to go on. And so, like you say, that sort of strangeness and how it wrong foots you is so fantastic. And the improvisatory quality of it, the way the narrator is basically shredded, it got rid of. That's amazing. That audaciousness of his writing to do that.
Absolutely. And rather than sometimes managing these transitions between the narratives with a real sleight of hand, you know, he just goes straight in, bold-faced, and said, well, I'm going to take the reader by the hand now and just carry you back to the other plot strand, because we need to go and meet some new characters now to bring into the narrative. So it's quite, you could call it clunky, but I think there is something there about pulling back the curtain of what fiction is in some ways. And all the way through, we see that Dickens is very interested in showing us readers reading or people listening to stories. And I think he's thinking, because it is a weekly miscellany, because he was writing this week by week, it was a sort of unprecedented relationship that he had with his audience. I think he's thinking about those readers listening to him as a storyteller and getting hooked on this story, which has an Arabian Nights quality as well to it. It just keeps on going and going and going.
Yes, I read the introduction or the preface, I think, where he mentions Tom Jones.
Yeah.
And actually that put in mind, I was thinking Tom Jones quite a bit as I was reading it, that idea. It's almost like as an author, he's ripping up the floorboards of the novel form and sort of saying, no, I can do this. I can change the narrator. I can do this. In the way that Fielding does when he says, no one can criticize me for writing in this way. I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, because this is a new form and I decide how it's done.
I think it's a novel of excess, really, in both directions. Dickens wants you to be weeping, actually weeping at one moment, and laughing out loud. Not just, that's funny, but really laughing out loud. And there are moments in this, I think of Whisker the pony, in particular, this particularly naughty quadruped, which, he's never doing anything that he should do. He's impossible to discipline, impossible to handle. But those scenes are just hilarious.
Yeah, they're so, so good. In fact, I don't know if you've seen Disney's Tangled, but Whisker reminds me of the horse Maximus in that. So Whisker the pony is very loyal to Kit, who's a lovely character, isn't he? And will do what Kit says. But is it the Garlands that have
Garlands?
Yes, and they're a lovely family, aren't they? But Whisker the pony won't do as he's told, and there's this nice, I love this description where they've been trying to find him for about a 3/4 of an hour, chasing him around a mill pond or something because he wouldn't come back. But then as soon as he sees Kit,
it seemed that Mr. Chuckster had been standing with his hands in his pockets, looking carelessly at the pony, and occasionally insulting him with such admonitions as "Stand still! Be quiet! Whoa!" and the like, which by a pony of spirit cannot be borne. Consequently, the pony had at length started off, and was at that moment rattling down the street. Mr. Chuckster, with his hat off and a pen behind his ear, hanging on in the rear of the chaise, and making futile attempts to draw it the other way, to the unspeakable admiration of all beholders. Even in running away, however, Whisker was perverse, for he had not gone very far when he suddenly stopped, and commenced backing at nearly as quick a pace as he had gone forward. By these means, Mr. Chuckster was pushed and hustled to the office again, in a most inglorious manner.
He has such a personality. I think that comparison with Tangled, there is a sort of Disney animal sidekick kind of aspect to Whisker in the role he plays in this story. And again, Dickens isn't afraid to be bold in the way that he's balancing the narrative. It seems to be coming too heavy. So, hey, let's just enjoy ourselves and have this funny scene with the pony. He's not too het up, I think, about being too serious.
Yes, and I know it's around the same sort of time, and listeners to this podcast know I have a bit of an obsession with Barnaby Rudge. But Whisker has a kind of grip kind of quality, doesn't he? In a possibly more innocent way. But it's that same sort of thing. Dickens has fun with animals in these early books, doesn't he?
And he's willing to give them a real personality and an inner life and a kind of motivation. I mean, some would say that Whisker has got a lot more personality than Little Nell, maybe.
Oh, it's so hard, isn't it? You know, I'm so defensive of Little Nell. It's funny, isn't it? Because I was ready to sort of think she was going to be awful and just unbearable to read, but I really, really care about her. It's hard. This is one of my questions for you: is who or what do you think Nell is?
Yeah, I think that is a great starting point and picks up on what we were saying about the way in which this novel challenges our expectations. Because again, I've come to Little Nell through the critiques, through the kind of Swinburne-like comments. I think he says something like she's a monster, as inhuman as a baby with two heads. Do you know, that's how odd she is as a character. And of course, that's making certain assumptions about what a character in fiction is or should be. It's presuming a kind of three-dimensional psychological complexity that I think, to be fair to Nell, we don't really see on the page. That isn't necessarily what Dickens is interested in investing her with. What we do know is she is beautiful. She is sweet. She is good. She is kind. She's beloved by everyone that she meets. She's also young and little, hence this diminutive Little Nell. And in terms of how she comes off of the page, I know that some people, it's a similar problem with Esther, although I'd say Esther is a bit more spicy. They feel like it's one of these diminutive women in Dickens's fiction that are just too good to be true, and they never kind of seem to act from their kind of true motivations or do anything that's kind of wild or edgy. Instead, she is purely motivated by her love for her grandfather and seeks to do everything to protect him at the cost, really, of her own life. So for many people, they come to this and they see a relatively flat, to use a term that's sometimes applied to Dickens's character, a flat character, one-dimensional. But I think not only can we push back on that sense of Nell's flatness, we know that she has an inner life because she's one of Dickens's dreamers in this novel. So we're getting that sense that actually there is a real depth there, even if we can only glimpse it. I think she's also functioning as a sort of symbol, really, as much as she's supposed to be a person. The whole novel is working not just on a kind of real world level, but on a fairy tale level, on the level of an allegory. And as an allegorical character, I think she works beautifully. She's almost like Christian in Pilgrim's Progress. She even makes, this is how obvious Dickens is with his readers sometimes. She literally says, I feel like we're Christian in A Pilgrim's Progress, if you haven't got the idea that she's allegorical, and we're leaving London behind, and, you know, we're going to the Eternal City. And if we understand her in that way, I think we can see that the characterization is much more successful. This is why she is perfect. This is why she is good. This is why her trajectory is strictly kind of to the ethereal, to the spiritual in the end. If you rounded Nell out and you made her a wonderfully rich character, a sort of Dick Swiveller, in a way you're giving her a bit too much personality, because I think central to Nell's function in this novel is the fact that she stands in for a sort of universal experience. So in the novel, we're told that she resembles her mother who died in childbirth. She resembles her grandmother who died in childbirth, we assume. Right, so already this beautiful, good, kind, sweet girl is standing in for all of these other tragic women. And then, beyond the novel, Nell is standing in for all of those other much mourned, much missed women who have died that readers came to this novel looking for. And I think that's part of the effect of the story, that they're reading Little Nell's narrative, but they're actually experiencing their own grief for their own lost loved ones. But you tell me, Dominic, how do you read Nell?
Well, her goodness, her sweetness, her angelic quality, I haven't got a problem with it. For some reason, partly because she has Quilp as the sort of demonic kind of character. So I can just take her as a almost Christ child, a sort of heaven sent. And I think that thing you say about Esther, I was thinking that too. And I think it comes back to that thing again of, I can understand why people would read it and think, oh God, she's got no character. She's so goody two shoes. I can't bear it. She's awful. But she doesn't attack or get angry with her grandfather. She rises above all the time. She's described as a superior being. And that's just what she is. And I think she's not made for this world. She can't live long in this world because it's not a world for her to belong in, perhaps. The only other thing I would say, it reminds me, I remember somebody talking about Lord of the Rings and saying how boring Frodo is. I find it really hard because he's such a boring character. But then you sort of think, yeah, but it really all hinges on Frodo being quite boring, actually, because he can't do the great good if he has any personal ambition. And there may be something in that as well, possibly.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a lovely comparison as well. And you need your protagonist to do something quite different to what you can do, all the fun that Dickens has with his minor characters. But with Nell, he needs to play it straight. I was thinking too, as you were speaking, her speeches, they sometimes are quite conventional. And it's interesting, when she's talking to grandfather, they often use this quite archaic speech, grandfather in particular, thou and thee. And do you know, it's got this not really contemporary Victorian feel. It feels much older in a way. Again, I think that plays to allegory. But so often we're seeing that personality through gesture, actually, in these quite small interactions that she has with people. I'm thinking of when she's interacting with the schoolmaster, for example, shortly after he loses his favourite pupil, another death that will prefigure Nell's own, of course. And in those tender gestures, in her responses to event, actually, I think there is a real depth there, albeit it's not presenting in this conventional way.
Yes, and there's something about Kit as well, where Nell's teaching Kit to read. And Kit's trying really hard, but he's not very good at it, and he breaks out into laughter all the time. And there's a sentence about Kit being the comedy in Nell's life.
Yeah.
But actually, there is more to Nell, but I got the feeling that from that there's more to her, but the circumstances drive away the potential fun side of her character, the carefreeness that she should have as a child that's being taken from her, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just another example of that, the child character, I mean, in a way she's an allegory for childhood, but she's made to bear adult responsibility to lead her grandfather to a different life, to save him, essentially. And so that's really all the narrative can allow her to do. It doesn't give her many other possibilities, and whether we see that as a sort of social comment on opportunities for women, whether we tie that up with a kind of biographical reading about Dickens and this idea of the sort of sexless younger character, she can't come into her own story because she cannot come to a sort of fully realised womanhood, or whether again we just return to this idea of she's taking part in a story that is different to the one that you think she's in, that's working on a whole range of different levels at once. I think it's definitely worth giving Nell a second look.
Yeah, I think she's great. And then, of course, when you have Quilp.
Yeah.
I mean, Quilp helps, by contrast, to make Nell very favourable, I think, as a character.
He's an extraordinary creation, isn't he? I mean, just tell me your first impressions when you came to Quilp on the page.
Well, do you know, I thought he was awful, and in a way that you can't necessarily enjoy his malevolence, can you? And something else that struck me actually through reading him throughout the story was his motivation isn't very clear, which then led me to then think that he is actually just meant to be a demon, and he's there to create mischief, upset, hurt, and Nell is the ministering angel on the opposite side, and they're That's who I think he is. I think he's a type, a symbol, is in much the way that Nell is.
Yeah, and so much of the language surrounding Quilp, I mean, the descriptors are really odd and weird and interesting. He gets aligned with so many different sorts of fairy tale or animalistic qualities. I think he's called an evil spirit, dismounted nightmare.
Yep.
He's dog-like, he is savage, but at the same time, he has got, which I think is his most frightening quality, this real kind of cunning and this ability to perform in a much more sinister way than someone like Dick Swiveller is, essentially performing and fictionalizing things. To perform civility, he knows what the social mores are, and so his defiance of them on occasion are even more sort of chilling, I think. And again,
Yes.
I'd say just like Nell, he's operating as a character in the real world. So we actually know a lot more about Quilp than we do about someone like Nell. We know that his profession is a moneylender and a shipbreaker. We actually see the environs that he inhabits, and we spend a lot more time in Quilp's home in Tower Hill, in his he calls it his kind of bachelor residence, this horrible decayed wharf, which is used for shipbreaking.
Yes.
And at the same time, he's operating as a kind of creature from fairy tales. So as you said, he's a demon. He's something malevolent. Everything about him is kind of excessive, because why does he pursue poor Kit so relentlessly? Okay, his grudge seems completely out of proportion to the offence. He's willing to get Kit convicted and transported for years and years of his life over a kind of insult that he feels needs to be avenged. And that definitely places him in the kind of unseelie court of these fairy tale characters who do act without a sort of psychological motivation, so much as enjoying pranks and mischief, often quite malevolent, for their own ends.
Yes. And in terms of reading it in the 21st century, with Quilp being one of the most hideous characters probably ever written by Dickens, but also being a dwarf. And it seems as though, he's describing him very vividly, and the dwarfism is mixed in with the ugliness, seemingly. What do you think about that? How do we read it and approach it?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think it's clearly problematic, and I think too, particularly of the other characters that we meet within this novel. So Vuffin, who shows dwarves and giants. That's how the text itself puts it. There is this interest in bodies that are different and in commodifying bodies that are different. I think Quilp is working in a slightly different way, and one way maybe to approach this or to think more about how a Victorian audience might have approached this is to think about how this novel is situated within a tradition of melodrama. So a kind of theatrical production in which appearance, good or bad, correlates very much with moral character. So it's all about a legible villainy. Quilp is a bad person, and so his body signals that to the world that he is somehow twisted or other. Whereas Nell, who is radiantly, brilliantly good, is of course a beautiful young child, unblemished. I think there are lots of problematic connotations there, but I think Dickens intends this to be read in that sort of stage tradition, where you can tell immediately who are the goodies and who are the baddies, just from the way that they're described. And we might think here, there's a nice kind of example of this when Kit is talking to Sampson Brass, this dastardly lawyer character who is in Quilp's service, and Brass himself is rather unprepossessing. So again, he has this kind of evil look to him. Kit doesn't trust him on instinct, but Brass is going on and talking about all of these good things he's done and the good things he intends to do for Kit. And Kit says to himself, "Oh, do you know what? I have misread him on his appearance." And so that is a case where actually Kit's instincts were right. Brass wasn't to be trusted. He was right to be guided by a kind of external manifestation.
Yes. Nell has the adult world thrust on her, but she still maintains a level of purity and innocence. Whereas Quilp, in his work and his money lending and all of that, is very steeped in the grubby, sort of dangerous side of life.
Yes, because so much of this novel is about kind of repetition with variation or contrast. So I think seeing those as paired figures, one so good, so kind of feminine, so extreme on the end of the scale. Quilp, so evil, so malevolent, so kind of potent as a masculine force. We think about the sort of sexual overtures he makes to Nell. We think about those awful, but also in some ways quite hilarious scenes where he's tormenting Mrs. Quilp the first, because he's approaching poor Nell to be Mrs. Quilp the second, and his mother-in-law. And do you know, there is a real kind of unusual sexual potency, I think, to Quilp there, which of course is the huge contrast to Nell, who is etherealized and spiritualized and very, very far from that worldly world.
Yes, in terms of that sort of sexual threat from Quilp, there's a really horrible moment where, I don't even remember, where he goes and lies down on Nell's bed.
Oh, yes,
and he chooses her bed to sleep in now, and for that to be his room because he's taken over the building, the Old Curiosity Shop, hasn't he? Yeah, and talking about, oh, Nellie, why don't you marry me? In 3-4 years, you'll be just right.
Oh, it's so sinister,
it is,
isn't it?
Yeah.
So sinister.
So that's Quilp. But also, what I found also interesting reading the book, and I'm sure you must have felt this, well, I assume, but I think Dickens sets Nell and Kit up to be a romantic item, I think. I certainly feel that.
Interesting.
Or maybe you didn't, but I definitely thought that. And then when Barbara appears and Kit gets closer to Barbara and Nell becomes something else. I don't know. Did you find that?
You know, that's really interesting. I don't think I had anticipated that Nell and Kit would be a match. Although actually thinking of that early scene of Nell teaching Kit to read, yeah, I guess there are some seeds there. And again, this goes back to the improvisational nature of the novel. Dickens is sowing lots of seeds, right? Because he's not quite sure which way he's going to take the narrative yet. I suppose part of what's interesting is that Nell is placed so overtly in the marriage market with the plot that her brother, Frederick Trent, sets up to match her with Richard Swiveller, which, you know, I guess maybe I was distracted by that as a potential match, as well as Quilp's awful advances. But it seems that everywhere Nell turns, do you know, that there is no escape from this kind of adult world, really. There are a lot of predatory forces in that novel, and again, often they're leavened by the idea of fairy tale that sort of in some way softens it, but nonetheless, she seems to be continually under threat. I think even of these small details when she's met up with Codlin and Short, the Punch and Judy men, and, you know, her ankles are being banged by the back of the punch tent, or when she is making her way by canal onto this hellish kind of city, and the bargemen require her to sing and keep singing to them, and you know, you think there is a real kind of sexual threat that Dickens is encoding here in the novel, a threat to Nell's innocence that needs to survive this kind of corrupted world.
Yes, I'd forgotten that. The bargemen, they're drunk as well, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you're in there, she's in this situation where they could be really friendly and cheering her, and then it could turn very, very horrible. But at the same time, the phrase you just used, the softening effect of fairy tale. And I think that's right, because when I was reading it also from the start, I was so struck by how violent it is.
Yes.
Incredibly violent. But as I was reading it, and I was thinking, you know, just reading all these bits about Quilp hiding behind a door to pinch his wife or something, you know, you suddenly realize, and I felt very early on that this is like Punch and Judy.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, halfway through, Punch and Judy players pitch up. So again, it's all kind of there. And I was very interested in that. But actually, more can be got away with because of the fairy tale element. Maybe. And
it's a sort of comic violence in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, again, talking of extremity, I'm thinking of that terrific, terrible scene in which Quilp feels the need. He's got to physically express his hatred for Kit. And lo and behold, he's managed to find a ship's figurehead, right? Looks like Lord Nelson, that he just uses to abuse and whip and hammer nails into, and chip bits off and carve his name
Yeah.
into.
There's the picture there in my copy. It's amazing, isn't it?
Incredible.
It's very hard to explain, but it's like a sort of voodoo.
Sort of effigy,
isn't
isn't it? Like a fetish
Yeah.
or an idol or something that he feels by taking out his vengeance, it will kind of take vengeance on Kit in person, I think. Again, an aspect of that magical thinking.
Yeah, and actually, oddly, this is where the picture in the book helped me to see that giant masthead that looked like Kit, because I might not have quite taken that in without seeing it. But of course, it has the wide mouth, Kit's wide mouth. And so it's deliberate. But you do think logically, how on earth did a masthead wash up that looked enough like Kit for not only Quilp to believe that it looks like Kit, but also Samson Brass?
So improbable.
Yeah.
And again, it's just that sense that actually Dickens isn't feeling the need to embed this strongly within a realist framework. There are these kind of more realistic elements for sure, but he's not afraid of really heightening these scenes. He's not afraid of having to explain everything logically, and that's quite liberating.
Yeah, and it reminds me, just this conversation, it reminds me so much of actually how much fun it is to read. I think that's you don't get that impression. Coming back to where I started, I felt like the title, a bit like possibly Little Dorrit or even Barnaby Rudge, those titles didn't grab me. If anything, I thought it might be a bit twee and a bit naff. But actually, it's really not. It's really definitely not. It's such a fun book, and the improvisatory quality means that as a reader, you're constantly wrong-footed. It's totally unpredictable, isn't it? Because even Nell's passing, I found, didn't happen in the way that I thought it was going to.
Interesting. Tell me a bit about that.
I was quite stunned when it came into that phrase, for she was dead. Boom. Because I was expecting a kind of Joe the Crossing Sweeper deathbed scene where she reads a passage from the Bible or something, and then the tears, or none of that. She's gone. I mean, I know with hindsight, I feel a bit silly not realizing that this is what had happened, because the snow comes in and you have the pathetic fallacy. I think I'm stealing that from Stephen Fry. He told me about that last time. But you have where the weather is representing what the character is.
That inner feeling, that emotional landscape. Yeah.
I'd want to turn the question back on you. What is it about that moment that sort of really strikes you?
Yeah, I think the first thing that struck me, and I do remember when I first read this, is it's just as you say, Dominic, it's that it was so different from what I was expecting. I mean, I knew that Nell died. Sorry, we should say spoilers here, should we? Nell's going to die at the end. And I knew that her fate was marked. And I think Dickens, although, there is some dispute, I think Forster says he suggests that she should die at a certain point in the novel. And Dickens said, no, it was my idea and I had it from the beginning. It was part of my conception. I think that Nell's death is being pretty strongly signposted. Every place that she turns up in, she seems to find either an inhabitant on their last legs or a graveyard to walk through. Do you know, it's like a critic has said, it makes England seem like a vast kind of cemetery rather than this living, vibrant landscape. So I knew it was coming. And I guess when I come back to this scene, when I teach this scene, I'm struck by how guided the reader is. There are these two interweaving plot strands. Nell is on a terminal trajectory. She's walking towards her death. I would argue that we know that from a very early point. And then in this other plot line, the stuff that happens in London, the stuff with Dick Swiveller and with Kit, and to some extent with Quilp, although he crosses between the plot lines, it's full of energy and humour and violence and all of this other stuff. But as that plot, as characters from the London half of the novel cross into Nell's story, there is this sense that they are running into death itself, and the narrative is shutting down. When they're in this carriage and it's a great pursuit, and we know that they're not going to bring Nell home alive, or at least I think most readers think that. But nonetheless, it's a pursuit scene, just like in Bleak House. We've got all this energy, we've got all this motion, we've got the ability to travel. A journey that has taken Nell the whole book is being covered in just a kind of page or two or three. And then suddenly characters from the London plot roll into the Nell plot, and we have it here. Suddenly, the rolling wheels were noiseless, and the sharp ring and the clatter of the horses' hooves became a dull, mothballed tramp. The life of their progress seemed to be slowly hushed, and something death-like to usurp its place. So they're rolling into this kind of terminal narrative, a narrative in which nothing really can survive. By the end, Nell will be dead, grandfather will be dead. There's a sense that there isn't so much life going on in that village, although, as we know, because Dickens is so keen to emphasise, much will live on in a different form. Death isn't final, but it's about conjuring these good deeds in the world that will follow in the wake of those who've lived in it.
Yes, you reading that little passage does make me feel like an idiot for not realising Nell had just died. It's so it's so obvious when you hear it with hindsight and it's read aloud like that. But I think also in terms of death, it's a very Christian.
Yeah.
So death is moving on to a better world. It's not oblivion. So that's worth factoring in as well. And again, that would probably lead a lot of critics after Dickens's time to think, oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
But actually it's very powerfully put here, isn't it?
It is so powerfully put. I think it's so much in this tradition of the evangelical tract, or of a genre that was known as consolation literature, things which are sort of evacuated of a high degree of specificity, because that's not the point. The point is that you read them and you're able to feel through them and exercise your own sort of experiences. That's how it works. And I think really this is how death works in the Old Curiosity Shop. All the way through, Nell is confronting other people's deaths or visiting cemeteries or so on and so on. She's learning about what death is, what it means to die, what it means to mourn and to be left behind. And Dickens is often quite explicit that these are moral lessons, okay? Sometimes the whole narrative takes the form of a sententia, a sort of moral phrase. It grinds to a halt just so we get the moral really, really clear. Think too in a more comic strain of Nell being taught by Mrs. Jarley the lives of all of these people, and she caps it with, and this is what young women should learn about the serial killer Jasper Packelman. Make sure he's not going to tickle you. There's a moral at the end of that story too, and really this is what we get in this great set piece relation of Nell's death. We are given a way to feel about it because Dickens inserts people who are mourning for Nell. It's this curious kind of all-male community of mourners, right? That's always struck me as a slight oddity, that in the antechamber to Nell's deathbed scene, it's all men there, but they are freely expressing their emotions, their tears, their love for one another, their love for Nell. So Dickens is, if you like, mirroring the response or staging a response to this grief that then his readers might end up mirroring.
Yeah. And I suppose the tragedies in Dickens' own life and the lives of just anybody, I suppose, living in that time.
Yeah.
It would have been a solace to, perhaps.
Absolutely.
It'll have a cathartic effect. Yeah,
catharsis, absolutely. And I think, sentimentality, because I think there are aspects here that are sentimental, it gets a kind of bad rap, because the idea is if we spend so long crying over people in fiction, we won't have the emotional resource to be able to cry over people who really need our tears in real life and to be moved to a kind of action. But actually, sentimentality is about building that sympathetic muscle in a way. Sympathy doesn't have to be a limited resource, and the idea is if we respond in fiction to a death like Nell's, allow ourselves to really feel it, we get that cathartic, moral, uplifting effect. We live through what the schoolmaster tells us to do, let this death be a lesson. Let 100 good deeds rise, from the memory of this young girl, and let that happen in our actual lives as well.
Yes, I dare to say in this moment anyway, I might retract it. I dare to say that the death scene for Nell isn't actually sentimental.
Yeah.
I think it's sentimental if we might read it in a moment. It's sentimental possibly if you read it out of context. But if you haven't had the full sweep and everything, all the events piling on each other that get you to that place, and all the fun and all the silliness as well.
Yeah.
Then yes, out of context, but that's Dickens all over, isn't it? Out of context Dickens, it's like with adaptations that only show his dark side, his dismal side, or his frothy side. Even within that whole section that you've highlighted here, for She Was Dead, it's very formal, isn't it? It's very stylized, the repetition of She Was Dead. But within that, there's that moment where, because the grandfather hasn't accepted or taken in that she's dead, and within that, they're trying to explain to him, no, she's gone.
She was dead. Dear, gentle, patient, noble Nell was dead. Her little bird, a poor slight thing the pressure of a finger would have crushed, was stirring nimbly in its cage. And the strong heart of its child mistress was mute and motionless forever.
When you hear some people read this scene aloud, that repetition for She Was Dead, it can sound funny. I have taught this in class, and we're each reading a sentence and someone gets another for She Was Dead, and, you think out of context, we've got it.
Yeah.
But I think you're quite right. When you have been on this, journey of more than 500 pages, right? When you have seen the way in which Dickens is alternating that idea of streaky bacon from Oliver Twist, the comic and the pathetic scenes, and suddenly we end up here, it is a culminating point. A huge amount is invested in Nell. And I guess what I find interesting is we don't actually get the really cliched Victorian deathbed scene. It's much, much more complex on the page because it's actually a kind of retelling. She's already dead. And then we go back and we hear it from one person, and then we hear another perspective and another perspective. And at the funeral, the villagers kind of reconstruct this whole other version of Nell's life and her death. So as always with Dickens, there's a kind of twist in the tale, a richness, a complexity that we need to step beyond our preconceptions to really activate, I think.
Absolutely. And also, because the grandfather, when Kit arrives and the grandfather says she's sleeping next door, and because she's, as you said, along the journey, there have been so many near misses where she could have just that night collapsed and died if she hadn't been picked up by the fire watcher or something like that, that the suddenness of that coming in is actually quite, I really didn't know it was going to happen like that. I really, even if you know the ending, the way it breaks in is very unexpected, I think.
It's a curious kind of suspense, isn't it? I think, because on one hand, you know where this novel is going. I mean, her name is Nell. It's sounding this death knell on every single page, every single time we hear her name. Nell. Her death is prophesied, really, I would say, from the start, when she sees improbably a coffin just pass her in the street, and that's symbolic. She's seeing death. But at the same time, I think there is an intensification in the way that scene is told. Kit's arrival, is it going to be a connection between these plots? Actually, it's a missed connection. And all of the framing devices, the fact that we see her things before we see her body. Nell, the person, not the icon. Here are the little shoes. Think of how many miles she's walked. It's giving us that more rounded sense of Nell before we get this more orchestral sense. She was dead. Yeah. She was dead. She was dead.
Yeah. And when you're reading it, you're so set up for Kit and Nell to be reunited, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's what you're robbed of. And that's probably why people got very cross about it. You expect, she's going to die, but you kind of expect him to get there in time, and to be reconciled to the grandfather and all of that. But it doesn't happen. And I think also, that thing about the love story that never happens between her and Kit, which I see. One thing is, I remember there's a sentence where Nell, quite early on, I think, and her grandfather are walking away on their pilgrimage, on their journey out of London. And she keeps seeing Kit's face in strangers. So she keeps
Yes.
thinking of it, which is always a kind of romantic, kind of telltale sign of a love interest, possibly.
Yeah, that's lovely. I guess in a way, thinking back to the balance between the narratives, we've just had Kit's reunion. You know, he's just been released from jail, hasn't he? And he gets to have this incredibly, again, extreme, to use that word, joyful reunion. So I guess the reunion is there in the London plot, in the world of the living. You know, I guess we couldn't have that reunion, however bittersweet, with Nell before her decease.
Yes. I mean, even Whisker gets his reunion with Kit,
Yes.
doesn't he? It's so kind of touching. Yeah. But there's some fantastic bits of that moment where Kit's in prison. He's visited by his mum and a few others in the family.
Yeah.
And they're all crying, except the baby, who's laughing because the baby thinks this extraordinary event that's happening has all been put on for him.
Yes.
The baby
yes.
misunderstands, misreads the situation and laughs.
Gosh, I love that scene. And it just shows you there is so much emotion, very legible emotion in this book. It isn't a restrained book by any stretch of the imagination. And people are always laughing or crying or hating or loving in the most extreme and overt fashion, I would say. It's not a subtle novel. It doesn't pretend to be. At the same time, so often things are being replayed in a parodic mode. I'm thinking really early on of when Dick Swiveller is writing to his aunt to obtain a legacy, and he's calculating the sentimental effect of his words, and he's sprinkling on, you know, some water to make it look like he's been weeping and weeping and weeping over this composition. And that, I think, is maybe what draws the novel back. The fact that, yes, huge pathos here, but Dickens is aware of that, do you know, and he can see how it will also work in a parodic way. He can balance it with comedy. That's its strength, I think. That's its kind of magic.
It works so well because of that, doesn't it? You get the real tears, and then you've got the crocodile tears happening as well. But even Mrs. Jarley's waxworks as well. That's such a fantastic sequence, and I suppose the symbolism there of people being like waxworks and all of that, and how ridiculous they are. I mean, the descriptions there are so funny. I love the idea of Mrs. Jarley not being aware of Byron being a scandalous figure for a girls' school to visit.
Parted from the rude public by a crimson rope, divers sprightly effigies of celebrated characters, clad in glittering dresses of various climes and times, and standing more or less unsteadily upon their legs, with their eyes very wide open, and their nostrils very much inflated, and the muscles of their legs and arms very strongly developed, and all their countenances expressing great surprise. All the ladies and all the gentlemen were looking intensely nowhere and staring with extraordinary earnestness at nothing.
I love all of those scenes. Again, they're just so full of energy, so full of life, so full of the capacity for transformation. I love it when, you know, she's adapting for different audiences. And what does she decide instead of...
Oh, it's great. Let's see if we can find it. They're just where she's swapping costumes.
And wigs so that someone completely different will be presented for the ladies' seminary.
Yes. So Mr. Pitt in a nightcap and bedgown and without his boots represented the poet Cooper. And Mary Queen of Scots in a dark wig, white shirt collar and male attire was such a complete image of Lord Byron that the young ladies quite screamed when they saw it.
That is terrific, I think.
Yeah. It's so good. And but then you get the reality again. I mean, even the touring puppet theatre company, with all the sort of punch and all the fancy of it, you have bitterness as well.
Yes.
Is it Codlin, I think, who's the really bitter one, grumpy, doesn't like doing the show. And when Kit goes to the theatre with his family and they talk about the violinists in the orchestra pit behaving like they know the play already and they don't want it to start. Always undercutting the magic, I think.
Yeah, I think there is such artistry there, isn't there, in being able to hold both of those things, having that kind of real cynicism at times, but also sometimes just leaning fully into the illusion and being swept up with it. I think too of all the performers that we see, you know, the dancing dogs and so on, and we get this backstage life, if you will. We get this perspective into what it's like when actually the footlights aren't on them, what they're like in their everyday, ordinary life. And it's not that glamorous. And actually, it's really hard work to be an itinerant showman and to move from place to place to place all the time. I think they have the stilt walkers and they've got their costumes on, but then they've got some old wrappers over the top to protect them. So it's showing us once again behind the curtain, but it's also fully willing to give into the complete magic of the performance when called upon to do so.
Yeah. And we've mentioned him a few times, but we've not given him the time he deserves, I think, is Dick Swiveller.
Oh,
Now, I don't want to answer this, but I want you to say what you think first about Dick Swiveller.
I think he is the most tremendous creation. I think Chesterton says that Dick Swiveller is the noblest of all the noble creations of Dickens. I mean, I think the fact that Dickens embeds part of his name in the character's name suggests already this kind of fondness, and the way in which he is able to repurpose snatches of song, poetry, and fit it to his exact circumstances, the way in which he is able to take the everyday and all of its hardships and create all around him this fiction of life. Here we see, in a much more positive sense than people maybe like Harold Skimpole say in Bleak House, people who live in a fiction that is harmful to others. Here, Swiveller's sense of make-believe, like when he is down in that gloomy cellar of the Brass's offices, and he renames that servant the Marchioness, and he says that this mucky old kitchen is a palace, and you are drawn into that illusion. He's just a completely magic kind of character.
He is. That reminds me. Does he say that he lives in apartments, but he only has one room or something?
Oh, yes.
And to be his friend, you have to go along with that fiction.
Yes, and you have to believe that his turned-up bedstead that he's pretending is a bookshelf or something, because of course he has a separate bedroom, is a bookcase.
In this flight of fancy, Mr. Swiveller was assisted by a deceptive piece of furniture. In reality, a bedstead, but in semblance, a bookcase. There is no doubt that by day Mr. Swiveller firmly believed this secret convenience to be a bookcase and nothing more, that he closed his eyes to the bed, resolutely denied the existence of the blankets. To be the friend of Swiveller, you must reject all circumstantial evidence, all reason, observation, and experience, and repose a blind belief in the bookcase.
I think Dickens is always really fond of these sort of authorial avatars. You think of how many people with the name Dick are running all the way through his fiction, from someone like Little Dick in Oliver Twist, who is this kind of, I think that's a parodic version of him, this maudlin poor little boy who dies, to other creations, like when he's taking his initial CD and reversing them in David Copperfield, DC. And I think Dickens, is willing to have some fun with this character, Dick Swiveller, certainly, particularly the way in which he's a bit of a fantasist, isn't he? But an absolutely charming.
Yes, he manages to sort of melt the heart of Sally Brass, doesn't he? which is brilliant. And he's obviously completely unaware. I think what's amazing is the descriptions of his fever when he gets ill.
Yes.
Happening in the midst of these cogitations to raise his hand, he was astonished to find how heavy it seemed, and yet how thin and light it really was. Still, he felt indifferent and happy, and unconsciously fell, in a luxury of repose, to staring at some green stripes on the bed furniture, and associating them strangely with patches of fresh turf, while the yellow ground between made gravel walks, and so helped out a long perspective of trim gardens. He was rambling in imagination on these terraces, and had quite lost himself among them, when he heard the cough once more. The walks shrunk into stripes again at the sound. "I'm dreaming," thought Richard. "I have woke up, by mistake, in an Arabian night instead of a London one."
And again, that is such a funny scene because they have all of these kind of revelations because the story's coming to an end and, Dickens has to start wrapping up. But he has to keep laying down. So there's a big revelation. And it says, and, he had to take a rest.
Yeah, that's very good. You have to read the book to know what we're talking about there.
You
It's
do,
very, very funny. But also, what I loved, I think Dick Swiveller was very important for me to really realise how much fun this book was going to be with the whole episode early on with Sophie Wackles.
Oh, yes.
And how that, how that plays out. Is it Cheggs, I think, who ends up getting Sophie in the end? And,
Market Gardener, yes.
And just the way all of that's played, like a deliberately gone wrong Jane Austen courtship. But his grief, where he plays the flute in the night, is such a fantastic standalone sequence, isn't it?
Mr. Swiveller groaned a little, walked wildly up and down, and even made a show of tearing his hair, which, however, he thought better of, and wrenched the tassel from his nightcap instead. At last, undressing himself with a gloomy resolution, he got into bed. Some men in his blighted position would have taken to drinking, but as Mr. Swiveller had taken to that before, he only took, on receiving the news that Sophie Wackles was lost to him forever, to playing the flute, thinking, after mature consideration, that it was a good, sound, dismal occupation, not only in unison with his own sad thoughts, but calculated to awaken a fellow feeling in the bosoms of his neighbours. In pursuance of this resolution, he now drew a little table to his bedside, and arranging the light and a small oblong music-book to the best advantage, took his flute from its box, and began to play, most mournfully. The air was Away with Melancholy, a composition which, when it is played very slowly on the flute, in bed, with the further disadvantage of being performed by a gentleman but imperfectly acquainted with the instrument, who repeats one note a great many times before he can find the next, has not a lively effect. Yet for half the night or more, Mr. Swiveller, lying sometimes on his back with his eyes upon the ceiling, and sometimes half out of bed to correct himself by the book, played this unhappy tune over and over again, never leaving off, save for a minute or two at a time to take breath and soliloquize, and then beginning again with renewed vigour. It was not until he had quite exhausted his several subjects of meditation, and had breathed into the flute the whole sentiment of the Pearl down to its very dregs, and had nearly maddened the people of the house, and at both the next doors, and over the way, that he shut up the music-book, extinguished the candle, and finding himself greatly lightened and relieved in his mind, turned round and fell asleep. He awoke in the morning much refreshed, and having taken half an hour's exercise at the flute, and graciously received a notice to quit from his landlady, who had been in waiting on the stairs for that purpose since the dawn of day.
It is an incredible set piece, tormenting all of his neighbours because he can't actually really play the flute, or at least not very well. So he has to play the notes very, very slowly over and over again, so it sounds nothing like what it should. But he feels he's rehearsing his melancholy through this exercise. So it's another instance, I think, of emotion being writ large. I was just thinking of how, in a way, Dick Swiveller and Kit, these are the characters who change, who have the ability to grow up, I think, in a way that Nell just doesn't have access to. Because when Kit is first introduced, you've alluded to this, he's quite a kind of comic character, isn't he? We feel he's kind of one note. He is the loyal servant, isn't he? Yes. But as the narrative goes on, he takes on a kind of growing maturity, I think. There's always this comic energy surrounding him, but he loses some of those more kind of caricatured elements, I think, particularly when he goes through his trials and becomes the person who at the end of the story kind of holds the narrative. He's telling this whole thing all over again to his children, and he's pointing out where the curiosity shop once stood. Whereas Dick Swiveller, as you say, he enters the novel, and I think he has the capacity to go either way, towards evil or towards good, depending upon how he is steered. But while poor Nell is declining into a consumption, Swiveller, in a sort of parallel way, goes through this great kind of illness causing his rebirth. So they're coming out in different ways. Nell dead in heaven, he reborn, but into life rather than into death.
Yeah, gosh, absolutely. There's so many layers, aren't there? I might have to read it again, but it's so good. But you mentioned there about Kit showing his children further on where the old curiosity shop used to stand. And that's something interesting about death in this, because we mentioned the Christianity and the eternal life and that's woven in. But the idea that actually things do disappear, and that's actually a good thing. That's kind of fed in as an idea as well, isn't it? Where Kit's he's trying to show them the old curiosity shop, and then he's suddenly not sure where it is anymore.
Yes.
Because the traces have gone. And it's not negative, actually. It's not a rueful thing. It's actually part of moving on.
It's really interesting, that, I think, because we see in Grandfather's Mourning, for example, an almost a sort of pathological attachment, albeit the grief is very, very fresh. But the way he's holding on to the slippers, clinging to a physical remnant of Nell, I think in a way is not really the story, if we think of this as a moral text, that Dickens wants to teach. He wants people to live on through memory and through the good deeds that they might inspire. So actually having the old curiosity shop there as a kind of monument or memorial to Nell and her death isn't really what the end of the novel needs to do. Instead, by knocking it down, it's this moment of modernity. It's a moment of progress. It's looking forward rather than always looking back. But in the fact that Kit is continually retelling this story, Nell gets to live on in that way.
Yes, and then there's even a moment, I think, where Nell's, I don't know if she's with the clergyman or one of the gentlemen in the village. Maybe it's the sexton, talking about the tombstones being forgotten sometimes by the relatives or being left for a long time. And she gets very upset, saying how quickly the dead are forgotten. And it's turned on its head by saying, no, life is being lived while that grave is overgrowing, which is the opposite of Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim, isn't it? It's the opposite of
with
promising.
The crutch, yes.
Yeah, and all of that, it's just a very interesting element again, where you think, oh, I see, this is a 19th century novel. It's going to be very Christian. It's not going to be questioning of Christianity. If you're going to enjoy it, you'll go along with that. But then at the same time, it has these very contemporary ideas of how you deal with loss and all of that. The other thing, which I thought was interesting, is the environment as well, isn't it? Obviously, that's very much on our minds in this heat wave today for us as we record. But the idea of the way, just the descriptions of the factories sickening like a horrible volcano, the landscape and all of that.
Yeah, I think those passages are, totally extraordinary. And when I reread the novel again to speak to you, I was so struck by the fact it's an industrial landscape, but really it's an apocalyptic hellscape. That's how it feels. It feels like the Pilgrim's Progress. It feels like they're walking through hell. Everything is black and nothing can grow. The carts that should be carrying produce to market are instead carting dead bodies. And Dickens doesn't shy away from, albeit he's doing it through this kind of allegorical frame, he doesn't shy away from the very real problems in the 1830s and the start of the 1840s, the huge unemployment, the fact that people were starving to death. I really think in a way the darkest moment in this whole novel is when Nell and Grandfather themselves, kind of feeling close to death, are begging for their bread at the poor man's house. And he says, well, what do you think I have to give you? What do you think that is on the floor? And it's a dead child. Another dead child in a novel that is sadly full of them, but that is so stark, I think.
Yeah.
So moving, but in a very, very different way from the way in which the spectacle of Nell's corpse is is moving to a reader, and it hits you again. It's this violence of the novel bubbling up again. It really strikes a powerful chord with me, those scenes.
It really does. And I think, again, you read the novel and it's really fun. And sometimes you feel like you're reading a cartoon. But as with always with Dickens, you're reading a cartoon, but you're seeing reality.
Yes.
Absolute reality. Certainly the reality of that world he was in right there and then. And the traveling around is very interesting, because that's another thing, just hearing you talk about the environment and everything, is that you get so much. They're on the road so much, aren't they? So things are passing, villages, cities, town, and that's a very interesting and colourful and just very enjoyable just to be sort of on that road with them, I think, just the descriptions. But also the other thing that really struck me, and I don't think I'd ever really felt this in a novel before, is the idea that inside, the world indoors is dangerous, and it's better to be out on a highway fending for yourself than to be home where it's dangerous and abusive.
Yeah, I think that is a great observation. It takes me back again to what you were saying about Quilp kind of colonising Nell's little bedroom and inhabiting that space in a truly malevolent way. Versus much better to leave the city, as you say, much better to be in the countryside, which here has often got a very kind of pastoral quality to it, a prelapsarian quality. It's seen to be closer to heaven in a way, because it's away from the man-made, the artificial, the worldly world. It's easier to get to heaven, we feel, in some of these remote villages than it is in the heart of London. We get this curious character when Nell and grandfather have reached the kind of the heart of the industrial world, the heart of the city, and they're taken in. It's this real moment of kindness and human connection. They're taken in by a character known only as the Fire Watcher, a curious individual whose only purpose, it seems, is to sit and watch this gigantic furnace. And that becomes, he talks about it as his memory. He can see in it pictures of things that have happened, pictures of things that he feels might happen in the future. I think that is, again, an extraordinary kind of imaginative scene.
Oh, yeah, I love that whole Fire Watcher sequence. It was brilliant. It's so powerful.
It's not a real factory. Do you know what I mean? No one else seems to be there. They never seem to make anything. But that's where I think we're kind of lifted again into that allegorical plane.
Yes, and I don't know if you ever get this as well, is, talking about the city and things, when it's explicitly something that's still there. Like, there's a moment where he describes St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's so brilliant to have that, isn't it? Because it's obviously still there now.
Yeah.
And just to have his eye on it, on those London landmarks that are still there.
Then came a turnpike. Then fields again with trees and haystacks. Then a hill, and on the top of that, the traveller might stop, and, looking back at old St. Paul's, looming through the smoke, its cross peeping above the cloud, glittering in the sun.
There's this vignette-like quality in the Old Curiosity Shop, and suddenly he'll strike you with an image. There's one moment, if I may, it's the image of the dove that has always kind of haunted me. It's this quotation. The narrator is talking about Nell looking up at the stars and then looking down at the stars as they're reflected in a body of water. And he says, shining in the same majestic order as when the dove beheld them gleaming through the swollen waters upon the mountain tops down far below, and dead mankind 1,000,000 fathoms deep. And in that moment, we've gone from this ebullient kind of comic, pathetic world, and suddenly the whole expanse of human history and its destruction and its afterlife is captured in this single moment of seeing. It's extraordinarily powerful, I think, isn't it? That idea of dead civilization, 1,000,000 fathoms deep. It's excessive, it's exaggerated, it's weird. But I think that is a quality of Dickens' writing. It's just got its kind of claws into me, and ever since I've just been enraptured.
Yeah, no, you reading that quote reminded me of reading it in the book in real time. It was amazing. It's like a quiet epic in some ways, isn't it? Very big existential ideas there reflected in it. Yeah. Oh gosh, Claire, thank you so much. This has been brilliant. Thank you so
My
much.
absolute
And everyone
pleasure.
needs to read.
Everyone should read it. Yes, absolutely.
Such are the changes which a few years bring about. And so do things pass away, like a tale that is told.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much and see you next time.